Okay, in the next couple chapters of our Revit book, we're going to be going over the different categories that Revit has to offer and how to create custom types, as well as adjust certain instant parameters to add them to a project. We're going to start off talking about walls. We're going to do a quick recap on placing and editing them, as well as creating our own custom wall types, adjusting detail levels within the drawing area, and adjusting the location line or justification. So let's get started. Okay, so here I have an empty Revit project, and I'm going to insert a wall. To do that, I can use the WA keyboard shortcut or go to the Architectural tab within the Build panel and click Wall. Now, Revit is ready to insert a wall. Now, we've done this before in previous videos, but we never really talked about the Properties panel. If you remember from our previous video on the Revit element hierarchy, you'll know that by clicking this drop-down, I can select different families and subtypes of walls to insert. So, let's take a look at this. You notice that there is a basic wall family here, and under it, a bunch of different types of walls. Right now, we have the generic 8-inch selected. So, we're going to leave that as is for now. Practice inserting walls, and then we'll go back into it. So, I'm going to select generic 8-inch. Now, Revit's waiting for me just to click to start placing a wall, click the next point, and then repeat as many times as I need. I could also enable the chain option so I don't have to click a start point again, and the next segment of wall starts from my last endpoint. Okay, so I have some walls drawn in here, and we know that by selecting it, I can go to the Properties panel, set the top constraint to a level, such as level 2, which will ensure the top of that wall stops at the level 2 marker. So if I hop into the north elevation, you'll notice that wall is constrained by level 2, and by modifying level 2, I'm going to modify that wall as well. Hop back to the plan now. Okay, so we learned about setting top constraints. However, we never really talked about this top offset. This top offset behaves really similar to the wall openings command that we covered in a previous video. You'll notice that if I put a top offset of 2 feet, and then go back to the elevation, that the wall exceeds the level 2 marker by 2 feet. Now, why is this? It's because the wall has a top constraint of level 2, but then we say you can offset that by 2 feet. So no matter what I make level 2, that wall will always be 2 feet above it. It's important to note I could also put negative 2 feet, which would always ensure that wall is below the level marker by 2 feet. Okay, now that we covered the top offset, let's go through all these different options inside of this wall. Let's start with location line. You may have noticed when I was placing the wall that my starting and ending locations were set to the wall center line. If I ever want to change that, I can click this location line drop down and change it to core centerline, finish face exterior, finish face interior, as well as core face exterior or interior. We'll go into those more in a second when we actually create our own custom wall type. The next option is base offset, which acts very similar to top offset, which allows you to offset the bottom of the wall from the base constraint. So if I enter 1 foot, you'll notice the wall begins 1 foot above level 1. I could also enter a negative number to make it start below the level. There's a checkbox right here to whether I allow this wall to bound a room. We'll talk about this more in another video. Another checkbox is the structural checkbox. However, we won't be covering that in this series, so it doesn't matter if you leave it checked or unchecked. You'll notice that Revit also gives you the dimensions of this wall, such as its length, area, and volume. It has also various identity data, such as image, comments, and mark. We'll talk about those more later. Okay, now that we've talked about the different properties of a wall, let's talk about creating our own custom type. If I do the WA command to initiate the wall command, I have the drop down which I can select, and it allows me to select from different families, such as basic wall, curtain wall, and stacked wall, as well as different types. For instance, for basic wall, I have 5-inch generic, 6-inch generic, 6-inch masonry, etc. So let's say none of these default wall types work for me, and I need to do a 7-inch wall. How would I do that? Well, if I uncheck this drop down, I have this little button here called Edit Type. If I click it, it brings up the Type Properties window. Now, there's a lot of options going in here, and we're going to go over all of them. So, the first thing I want you to do is click this little preview button. This will show a preview of the current wall if it was inserted into your Revit project. You can see right up here, I have the family drop down to select a different family, such as curtain walls, stacked walls. We're going to leave it on base walls for right now, basic walls, I should say. And then below it, I have a type drop down. If I click the type drop down, I can see all the different types of walls. If I select generic 6-inch, you'll see the wall changes in the preview. If I select a retaining 12-inch concrete wall, you can see that the wall not only changes the interior shading, but also adds a hatch pattern. So we want to create our own custom wall type. To do this, you want to select a existing type that is as similar to the new type of wall that you're going to create. In this case, I'm going to stick with generic 8-inch. Then I'm going to duplicate this type. Revit's going to ask me to insert a name. It's important to be as descriptive as possible as your name so that you know to go back to it in the future within your Revit project. So I'm going to call this a concrete wall 12 inches to signify that it's a concrete wall that's 12 inches thick. Now when I click OK, you'll notice that the type changes to my new name. However, the preview doesn't. This is because the type name has nothing to do with the actual properties of the wall prior to you changing them. So it's important that any changes you make, that the properties of the wall match it. Of course, if you ever want to change the name, you can use the rename button. Now let's start with editing the structure of this wall. To edit the structure, you're going to click the Edit button within the Value column. Here, another box appears, and you can notice that the preview still remains on the left-hand side, but on the right, I have a table. Every single wall within Revit has layers, and these layers can be really useful. Let's take a wall in your house, for example. Your wall in your house, you may look at it, and it might be drywall on the exterior, paneling on the exterior, but there's a lot more going on inside of that wall. You could have wooden studs, you could have steel studs, you could have a layer of insulation, you could have drywall, and then you could have paneling on top of it. In order to have an accurate BIM model, you want to match these layers within your wall. So I'm doing a 12-inch concrete wall. So for right now, I'm only going to have a single layer. But if I wanted to add additional ones, I could use this Insert button right here. Now you'll notice that there's also two existing layers, core boundary and core boundary. Now, these are not actual layers of material. They are simply the bounds of the core of the wall. You notice when I was inserting a wall, and we'll go into it in a second, I had the option to place the wall using its center line, its core interior, its core exterior, as well as its face. If I drag this first layer, called structure, and I move it up using this up button, I've moved it in front of the core boundary. This means when I insert it, if I select core boundary, the insertion point of the wall would be on the core boundary, and if I had, let's say, 2 inches of material out here, it would be offset 2 inches. We'll cover that more in detail when we actually start creating walls for our project. For now, I'm going to go down, I'm going to delete these 2 additional layers and leave it on a single layer. Now, I have this drop down for function. Every layer within a wall has a function. The selections are structure, substrate, thermo/air layer, finish 1, and finish 2, as well as a membrane layer. For now, I'm going to leave this as structure. If I click the drop down for material, I can change the material of the wall. Here, I get a whole bunch of options. Some of these options pertain to how the wall will look in 3D, and some pertain to how it will look in 2D. For now, I'm just going to search for concrete, click enter, and see what comes up. I have a concrete cast and play gray option. I'm going to select that, and now let's look over here on the right. We're going to cover this box in more detail in a later video, but for right now, you can see that there are 2 types of pattern, a surface pattern as well as a cut pattern. A surface pattern will show when you are looking from the top, but you are not slicing into the wall, where a concrete pattern will show, in this case, when you cut through the wall. If this seems a little bit confusing, we'll go into it in more detail when we cover sections. For now, I'm just going to click OK. You can now see that my preview updates to show concrete on the left-hand side. The next column is thickness, and right now it's set to 8 inches. However, I'm trying to create a 12-inch thick layer, so I'm going to change the 8 to 12. This last option, structural material, refers to its use in structural analysis. For now, I'm going to leave it checked. We'll cover wraps in a later video. Okay, so now I have my custom wall that is 12 inches thick, and it has a material concrete cast in place gray. If I click OK, I now return to the type properties box. Here I can change some settings that appeared in the edit structure box, such as wrapping at inserts and wrapping at ends, as well as some additional options. First, let's take function. Function is a simple drop-down that lets you select the function of this wall. In my case, I'm using this for exterior walls, so I'm going to leave it as exterior. Next is graphics. Here I can adjust the scale, fill pattern, as well as the fill color. We're going to talk about that more in detail in a later video when we discuss graphics. Next are the analytical properties of this wall. We're not going to go into this in this series of videos, but this is where you could add your thermal mass, thermal resistance, your heat transfer coefficient, as well as your absorbance and your roughness. All these elements could be used for later analysis. Lastly, you have your identity data. Now, identity data is metadata that's tied to the wall itself. This can be helpful when you're trying to create automatic schedules, legends, as well as annotations. We're going to cover that more in detail in the video later. Right here in the lower left-hand corner, you notice there is a view drop-down. When I click it, I have two different options, floor plan and section. If I select section, I get to see what this wall is going to look like in section. If I change it back to floor plan, I get to see what it would look like in plan. Depending on what you're trying to modify, you may want to switch the view. If I click OK, you'll notice my new wall type is selected within the Properties panel. Now, if I click to start a wall and then click to end it, I now have my wall drawn. But you may notice something. The wall does indeed look thicker. However, it doesn't have the material properties that we saw in the preview, and this is caused by a graphical setting. And this setting can be adjusted within our view control bar. To change it, you simply click the drop down to the right of the scale and change the level of detail from coarse to fine. Now you can see the hatch pattern for concrete appear. If you have a really massive drawing, it can sometimes be useful to change the detail level to improve performance. I'm going to leave mine at medium. You can read more about the different levels of view details in your book. Alright, and that's how you create a custom wall type.